Okay then, welcome to our next series of lectures. For the next 4 lectures, we're going to be looking not precisely at Orthodoxy itself, but rather the environment in which Orthodoxy and the Orthodox Church operated. It's important to remember throughout this course that Russia was an empire, one of the largest empires in the world, in fact. And as such, it had an extremely diverse population, with many religious groups living side by side with Orthodox people and with the Orthodox Church. And these peoples had their own religions. The state and the church had to develop strategies to manage their relationships with these religions, and vice versa. These religions had to develop tactics and strategies to organize their relationship with the state and the Orthodox Church. So today's lecture will be about the so-called tolerated faiths. That is to say, the faiths which were given a degree of legal recognition within the Russian Empire, were given a position, were allowed to exist in law, and to a certain extent were co-opted by the imperial state. These religions, we're going to see a few examples throughout this lecture today, but I'm talking about Lutheranism, Catholicism, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and a few others. Tomorrow, in the next lecture, we're going to look at groups which fell below this threshold of legality. The Old Believers, various sectarian groups who were forbidden by the imperial law code and subjected to a degree of persecution. In the third lecture, we're going to look at the Russian Orthodox Church's missionary efforts, both looking deep into the history of those efforts and their development in the course of the 19th and 20th century. And then finally, we'll have a lecture about Orthodoxy in the Baltic, where the church was a minority faith as compared to the majority faith, which is Lutheranism, and where it was essentially a missionary faith, trying to convert Latvians and Estonians to the Orthodox Church. Another major theme we're going to see today, especially, but also throughout these next few lectures, are themes discuss about toleration and freedom of religion, or freedom of conscience. These are values which are... Toleration is a value which is permanently encoded in one form or the other into the Russian Empire's legal system. Of course, that's not to say that toleration wasn't violated, but it was, at least officially speaking, the stance. Religious freedom and freedom of conscience more generally had a lot more difficulty becoming accepted, and indeed, freedom of conscience never truly was accepted, even if it was eventually included into Russian law after the October Manifesto of 1905. It never really had a large impact on how the Russian state treated its religious minorities. These are some of the concepts that we're going to look at today, and I'm going to go into detail about why, indeed, there is a difference between toleration and freedom of conscience, and what that distinction meant in legal and practical terms for the Russian state. Now, and for, of course, the religious minorities who were subject to that state. So the first thing I want to do is open with give you a brief outline of some of these concepts. So an important one to understand, and it's something we've been discussing throughout this series in terms of the Russian Empire, is the distinction between a privileges-based regime and a rights-based regime. often when we discuss the Russian Empire, it's hard to avoid using the terms of rights, because we modern people have grown up in a world which is determined, which is shaped by a rights-based culture. However, this is not the world of the Russian Empire throughout the majority of its existence. It really wasn't the world of most of Europe until coming towards the end of the 19th century. Now let's see, what do I mean by a privilege? A privilege is something given as a gift. It is something that, therefore, it is also something that can be taken away. It is dependent on the goodwill of the person giving it. If that goodwill, for some reason, evaporates, then the privilege can be removed. Now, this is fundamentally different from a right. A right is something that is inherent, either to a human being or to a citizen, that cannot be alienated, cannot be removed by any state organ, by any social group, or even by the individual themselves. Some argue that this is a God-given factor. Others are something that is given by God inherently to humans. Others argue for a more secular approach. But generally speaking, this is the idea. A right is something that is inalienable to a human being. It cannot be removed or taken away. A privilege, however, is something that is given, and therefore that's something that can be taken away by some group or individual in authority. Now, this philosophy of rights starts to gain traction, at least on an intellectual level, at the end of the 17th and 18th century, especially in certain circles in the Enlightenment. And we see probably its first political manifestations in the American Declaration of Independence and in the Declaration of the Rights of Man issued at the beginning of the French Revolution. And gradually over the course of the 19th century, more and more European states start adopting this discourse of rights into their legal codes, into their legislation, and start treating their citizens, their subjects, as if they have these inalienable rights. And of course, by our current day, it's difficult to find a regime which does not, in some way or the other, operate on the basis of rights. Of course, that is not to say that many regimes do not violate these rights, but there is nonetheless a concept, even in these regimes, that something is being violated, and that human rights are something that they have to protect, even if in name alone. But it's important to remember the Russian Empire is throughout this time period, from 1721 until 1905, is a privilege-based regime. The status that people have within society, the responsibilities, the advantages that their groups possess, the advantages and responsibilities that individuals possess, are privileges. They are things that can be issued and withdrawn by the Russian state in the sake of maintaining social order, in the sake of pursuing a particular set of political, ideological, or social goals. And religious privileges issued to groups in particular are one of the most fundamental varieties of privilege that the Russian Empire issues. This situation does change slightly, as I've said earlier, in October 1905, when under pressure from the Russian Revolution, the First Russian Revolution, Nicholas II issues the October Manifesto, which does issue a series of rights, of freedoms to people. However, as I said, these freedoms are never properly legislated into the imperial law code, and they never really fundamentally serve as a basis for Russian imperial policy, either in the grand scale or on the micro scale. Now, what do I mean by toleration throughout this lecture? Firstly, we need to understand toleration as precisely one of these privileges I mentioned earlier, being legally permitted to exist. For a religion being legally permitted to exist is a privilege given to that religion by the state. It has no particular right to exist, it is given a privilege to exist. And should the Russian state decide, that can be withdrawn. Now, another issue with tolerance and toleration, I mean, both words can be used to translate the Russian notion of veleterpimust. Toleration has come to be understood today in a very wide-ranging way, as something denoting openness, open-mindedness, liberality, etc., etc. Historically, however, this is not the meaning of toleration either in its dictionary sense or indeed within its practical application to multi-confessional religious societies. Still today in English we use the idea to tolerate as to deal with something that we dislike, something bad. I tolerate the noise that my neighbours make downstairs. In other words, I don't like the noise my neighbours are making, but I deal with it, I put up with it, I live with it. And really this is the concept, this is the meaning that the religious toleration carries until deep into the 20th century. It means if a religion is a tolerated religion, it is something whereby the state doesn't necessarily agree with that religious belief. It may not think it is true. It may not think it is even right or correct. But for the sake of social order, for the sake of an imperial order in the Russian case, it tolerates the existence of these groups. Now, of course, you might ask the question, how can the Russian state, which remember is officially an Orthodox state, deal with, allow groups to exist that it thinks are wrong on some level, perhaps on the level of religious truth it thinks are wrong, or perhaps thinks maybe are even morally wrong. How can it allow these groups to exist? And indeed there is a fundamental tension within really with what we might call the Russian imperial ideology. On one hand, it's an officially Orthodox state charged with defending the interests of the Russian Orthodox Church and indeed even spreading the Russian Orthodoxy within its empire. But this is counterweighed, on the other hand, by the practical need to administer the empire, to allow subject minority peoples to practice their own faith, and in this way gain their loyalty and prevent social disorders emerging because of the prohibition of this particular religion. In other words, toleration is essentially a practice of imperial rule. It functions to secure the loyalty of subject populations and to reduce civil disorder and disruptions that might be caused by forcible conversions, and by missionary campaigns. But nonetheless, there is always the question, would it not be better to convert these peoples to Orthodoxy? Should not the Russian state be interested in converting these peoples to Orthodoxy? Now, just to give you an idea of the confessional diversity of the Russian Empire, I give you this statistical table. So as you can see, unsurprisingly, the Orthodox Church is the largest confession in the Russian Empire. Now, I should also mention this figure does not necessarily represent one group. We should remember that there were several national churches that had been amalgamated into the Russian Orthodox Church from the end of the 17th to the beginning of the 19th centuries. I'm talking specifically here about the Ukrainian Church and the Georgian Church. All of these groups, generally speaking, were scattered over large spaces, and they cannot be considered to be single homogeneous entities. Both Sharia, both Sunni and Shiite Islam were present in the Russian Empire. There were various forms of Judaism present in the empire, different types of Catholicism present, different types of Protestantism. So even within this sort of quite already very diverse general picture, there are additional layers of diversity. This is an extremely complex religious picture, an extremely heterogeneous empire. Now, what can I say about sort of talking about in generalities here about the situation, Orthodoxy's approach, the Russian state's approach to non-Orthodox religions before the beginning of the 19th century? Well, Peter the Great, especially by his admirers in Europe, was reputedly quite tolerant. And indeed, he was amenable to allowing those foreigners who came into Russian service to have their own faiths. Very famously, in St. Petersburg, he made sure to build Lutheran churches, Catholic churches, Armenian Gregorian churches. But he did so mainly for those foreigners who entered Russian service. He was far less amenable to Russians converting away from Orthodoxy. One group who was absolutely forbidden until the end of the 18th century in the Russian Empire were Jews. They were forbidden from settling in the Russian Empire. And indeed, there was a great deal of casual and ideological anti-Semitism present within Russian society itself and within Russian state policies. I've given you an example here of a public burning of a Jewish merchant involved in what was known as the blood ritual. This was the idea that Jews would murder, the absolutely false idea, I should add, that Jews would murder Christian children to use their blood in their religious ceremonies. And for allegedly being involved in this kind of activity, this particular Jewish merchant was burnt alive, but at the order of the Russian state. And there was a large campaign by Empress Elizabeth in the 1840s, 1850s against the Muslims and the so-called pagan peoples, the pagan Finno-Ugric tribes on the Volga, forcibly converting them to Orthodoxy. These campaigns were highly destructive. The vast majority of mosques in the Kazan region, a majority Muslim region, were closed or destroyed, and a huge number of these nature-worshipping Finno-Ugric and Turkic peoples were converted to Russian Orthodoxy under a great deal of pressure, forcibly converted to Russian Orthodoxy. I bring up these examples, by the way, to demonstrate, and we're going to see it throughout this lecture, that even though on some level, at least the highest ideological level, the Russian state guaranteed a degree of toleration throughout most of this period to non-Orthodox faiths. This toleration was always contingent on the particular group involved and the particular policies of a ruler and the particular region we are discussing. Now, under Catherine, a new approach begins. This is what the very prolific American historian Paul Worth calls the multi-confessional establishment. And what do I mean by the multi-confessional establishment? From the 1760s until the 1830s, the Russian state begins to form a series of legal arrangements that bind the tolerated faiths to the Russian state. Not only do they attempt to bind them to the Russian state, they attempt to essentially co-opt them, to bring them in as mechanisms into Russian into the Russian administration. I'm going to show you in chart form how this worked in a second. But just go on at a more theoretical level. Basically, the Russian state was creating central institutions for the tolerated Russian faiths. Institutions that were in charge of running the affairs of these various non-Orthodox groups. And these central institutions were connected to the organs of the Russian state. Indeed, between 1817 and 1831, a special department was created within the Ministry of Internal Affairs precisely to act as the bureaucratic bridge between these new centralized institutions for non-Orthodox faiths and the rest of the Russian government. Through the centralized administrations for non-Orthodox faith, the Russian government was able to administer these faiths on a level that had previously not been seen. This order was inherently flexible, could be constantly subjected to changes, the withdrawal of privileges, the addition of responsibilities, the adding of privileges, depending on policies, depending on the context of the time, depending on the behavior of these religious groups, and depending on various ideologies floating around in intellectual and government circles. In this way, the Russian state played a direct role in managing the affairs of non-Orthodox faiths for the benefit of Russian political goals. So here is basically the structure you can see. So I've given you 3 examples here, which is the Muslim Spiritual Assembly. As we're going to discuss, this was in the town of Ufa. Then there was the General Lutheran Consistory, in charge of all of the Lutherans of the Russian Empire. This was created in 1832 in St. Petersburg. And I've also given you the sort of the Russian-created Buddhist leader, I don't really know how to pronounce this, the Bandido Kamo Lama, who was in Irkutsk and governed the affairs of the Russian Empire's Buddhists. And as you can see, this is a system for managing the affairs of these non-Orthodox Russian religions, tying them strongly into the Russian state system. The chart we have now is basically how non-Orthodox religions were organized. The Russian state did not treat all non-Orthodox religions in the same way. Indeed, it had a basic hierarchical principle of the kind of privileges and limitations that would be assigned to all of these groups. And really, I've called this here the hierarchy of toleration. At the top was the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, which was not considered a tolerated faith. It was the predominant and preeminent faith of the empire. Beneath them was so-called Inoslavia. That meant the non-Orthodox Christian confessions. In other words, the Protestants, the Catholics, and the Armenian Gregorians. Beneath them were so-called Inoveria, that is to say, non-Orthodox, non-Christian groups. So in other words, the Muslims, the Jews, the Buddhists, and a few others. These were the groups which had some kind of legal existence within the Russian Empire. Usually they had an authority created by the Russian state, which was connected to the system I just showed you, connected to the departments for the spiritual affairs of foreign faiths, and thereby was connected to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. As we're going to see, the Russian government supported the clergy or the religious officiants of these groups, often sometimes by granting privileges in law, for instance, things like exemption from conscription, exemption from tax, the same kind of privileges, in fact, that the Orthodox clerical estate possessed. And these faiths were publicly permitted. The existence of, say, Lutheran churches, Muslim mosques was allowed. Public religious ceremonies could be conducted. The extent of these privileges were, of course, could always be changed. They could always be removed or added to, depending again on the policies of a particular government, the goals of the time, ideologies circulating within government circles and intellectual circles. Now, sitting on the cusp of illegal and legal were the Old Believers. And we're going to discuss them in detail in our next lecture. Just briefly now, the Old Believers were sometimes tolerated, sometimes brought into the fold, but also often subjected to a significant degree of persecution, often were often regarded with a degree of as being, to some extent, illegal. And beneath them were various sectarian groups who were subjected to various degrees of legal persecution. These forms of legal persecution could range from fines to the arrest of religious leaders, the exile of religious leaders, and in some cases, the exile of the entire groups to different parts of the empire. And again, we're going to discuss them in more detail tomorrow, in the next lecture. Now, I said that all groups had different privileges and different limitations and responsibilities within this system, within this sort of graded hierarchical system. But there were some limitations that were universally true for all tolerated and non-tolerated groups. Firstly, let's keep in mind throughout the next 4 lectures, the orthodoxy, that it was always considered a crime to convert away from orthodoxy, at least until 1905. converting away from Orthodoxy, i.e. apostasy, was simply not permitted by imperial law. It was a criminal offence. A far more serious criminal offence was trying to tempt people away from Orthodoxy. This could be punished with administrative exile, as many old believers or believer leaders found out. In other words, therefore, most groups were not allowed to actively spread their faith. They were not allowed missionary movements. The only group that was allowed a missionary movement within the Russian Empire was the Russian Orthodox Church. This is one way the state protected the interests of the Russian Orthodox Church. Firstly, it prevented other groups from attempting to convert Russian Orthodox people to different faiths. And secondly, it protected the Russian Orthodox Church from competition from other religious groups. And of course, the religious officials in these various different religions had certain state responsibilities, just as the Russian Orthodox clergy had certain administrative bureaucratic duties that they owed to the Russian state. They were expected to preach loyalty to the empire. They expected to read out laws and regulations to the faithful, and they were expected to collect a certain amount of statistical information for transmission to eventually to the organs of the Russian state. Things like birth registers, marriage registries, death registries, etc., etc. And of course, they were supposed to transmit information about the social atmosphere, the political atmosphere in their among their groups. And as I mentioned, there were, of course, some privileges. So, for instance, there was so basically, usually it was the ability to exist publicly, the ability to publish religious materials, the fact that your clergy possessed certain privileges, clergy or religious officiants possessed certain privileges, such as immunity from conscription, immunity from corporal punishment, immunity from taxation, etc., etc. And of course, these clerical figures, these religious leaders, their authority over their flocks was backed by imperial law. It could be backed by police or army support, in other words. In many ways, therefore, the religious leaders of the tolerated faiths are state agents just in the way the Russian Orthodox clergy often function as state agents. And of course, one question in mixed borderlands was the question of mixed marriages. What did you do if an Orthodox person married a non-Orthodox person? And following from that, what would you do from any children born in this marriage? In which religion were they to be raised? Now, canonically speaking, the Orthodox Church rejected the validity of mixed marriages before the beginning of the 18th century. Basically, the Orthodox Church's stance was mixed marriages were not allowed. If you want to get married, then the party who is not Orthodox has to convert before the marriage. Now, Peter, in fact, changes this and actually permits mixed marriages between Orthodox and non-Orthodox individuals. He essentially pressurizes the synod into making this change away from long-established Orthodox practice. it's noteworthy that this is only really confirmed in secular law and a series of firm arrangements put into place in 1832. And this established a basic procedure for mixed marriages. And here is that procedure. So basically, on getting married, when an Orthodox person married a non-Orthodox person, that non-Orthodox person had to promise that they would not tempt their partner to join their religion. They had to sign legal documents to this effect. And those legal documents could, of course, be enforced, at least in theory. And with regard to children, the children in this marriage had to be raised in the Orthodox faith. Legal documents had to be signed by the non-Orthodox partner promising to raise the child in the Orthodox faith. And again, these could be enforced by police and legal measures. I can tell you the case I was looking at in the archive recently, where in Estonia, where an Orthodox woman married a Lutheran man. They had a child, and they did not baptize that child in Orthodoxy. And as a consequence, the local courts sentenced them to 4 months in prison and considered giving the child either to Orthodox relations of the mother or to an Orthodox state-appointed protector. And while they were in prison, the parents authorized the baptism of their child into Orthodoxy, which meant that they were released, so long as they promised, once again, to raise the child thoroughly in Orthodoxy. So the punishments could actually be quite harsh for violating these regulations. Another issue to always keep in mind when we're discussing the question of religious minorities. Most of these minorities were not in the central Russian provinces. They were located on the borderlands of the empire. They were basically located in areas the empire had expanded into during its growth between the 16th and the end of the 19th centuries. And as such, they often had co-religionists who lived in other states. And sometimes other states had those, were officially, beg your pardon. This meant that these religious minorities sometimes had protectors who lived over the border. Let's consider the Lutherans of the Baltic, for example. Germany. Most of Germany, especially after German unification in 1871, was a Lutheran state. And often the German government and the German press would complain about mistreatment of Lutherans in the Russian Empire. Now, this could be both a strength and a weakness as far as the Russian state was concerned. On the one hand, it had to be continually concerned that its religious minorities might be more loyal to other states who officially belong to that religion. So, for instance, one of the constant questions Muslim Tartars was, one of the constant fears about the Muslim Tartars was that they were more loyal to the Ottoman Muslim Turkish Sultan than to the Russian Tsar. And during the constant wars against the Ottoman Turkish Empire, there were constant fears that the Tartars would rebel against the Russian state. This had absolutely tragic consequences in the Crimean War, where the Russian army in the Crimea essentially treated the Tartars as a disloyal, traitorous population and subjected them to a great deal of violence and destruction. But, on the other hand, possessing these faiths could give you a tool to interfere in the affairs of other empires. As you're going to see, this is how the Russian state consistently used its Armenian Gregorian minority. The Armenian state at this point was divided between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And the Russians used the fact that they controlled one of the Armenian leaders, one of the Armenian religious leaders, to continually, as a tool of pressure on the Ottoman Empire. So, let's have a look then at how this system operated in practice. And let's look at just very brief overviews on the different religious groups in the Russian Empire and how this system of toleration connected them to the state and how it changed over the courses of the 18th and 19th century. Now, I want to let you know that, of course, I could hold entire lecture courses on, let's say, Islam in the Russian Empire, on Judaism in the Russian Empire, on Catholicism in the Russian Empire. The following introductions are just that. They are very brief introductions, looking at a very limited part of the religious lives of these groups, namely their connection with the Russian state and their position in Russian law. So on Lutheranism. Now, I'm actually going to be relatively brief here because I'm going to talk in very great detail about the connection of Lutheranism to the Russian Orthodox state when I discuss Baltic Orthodoxy in three lectures' time. But basically, here is the general position. In 1721, after the Great Northern War, Peter the Great guarantees the privileges of the Lutheran Church in the Baltic provinces, in Livland and Estland. This means that, for all intents and purposes, the religious predominance of Lutheranism within the Baltic provinces does not change. In the beginning of the 19th century, another predominantly Lutheran area is brought into the empire. This is the Grand Duchy of Finland. Now, Finland is a different case, as we would say in English, a very different kettle of fish to the rest of the Russian Empire. Because the Duchy of Finland is basically almost independent of the rest of the Russian Empire. The Tsar is the Prince of Finland, but Finland has its own constitutional government, which is distinct from the rest of the Russian government. And so in Finland, Lutheranism is in fact the state religion. It's the only part of the Russian Empire where Orthodoxy is not the state religion. Now, at the end of the 19th century, the Russian Orthodox state does, to a certain extent, sponsor an Orthodox mission in Finland. And this provokes quite a few conflicts and confrontations with the Lutheran elites and the Lutheran Swedish government. But Lutheranism there is really autonomous of the rest of the Russian state. It is not joined to the Russian state in the same way Lutheranism is in the Baltic. And how is Lutheranism in the Baltic joined to the Russian state? Well, in 1832, basically Nicholas I creates the General Lutheran Evangelical Consistory in St. Petersburg, and this body is responsible for not only the Baltic states, but all of the Lutherans in the Russian Empire, except, of course, in Finland. And this means that the local Lutheran churches in the Baltic provinces lose a great deal of their autonomy and now become subject to this Lutheran consistory in St. Petersburg, which in turn is connected to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Lutheranism's position in the Baltic states, in the Baltic provinces, was confronted by a series of challenges from 1832 onwards. With its subordination to the general Lutheran consistory, and through that consistory to the Russian state, it now had to deal with a greater degree of state intervention into its affairs. For instance, it now had to seek permission from the Ministry of Internal Affairs to publish its religious literature. And that religious literature had to be reviewed by censorship committees in the central state organs. Another serious challenge occurs in the 1840s, when approximately 100,000, mostly Latvian but some Estonian peasants, convert to Russian Orthodoxy, creating in the Baltic provinces a substantial Orthodox minority for the first time. This creates problems of many of these converts joining Orthodoxy for not entirely sincere reasons, not entirely genuine reasons, trying to return to Lutheranism, and therefore committing apostasy. The state in the 1860s decided it would ignore these cases of apostasy in the Baltic states, the Baltic provinces. But later, in the 1880s, the state, influenced by Russification and attempts to Russify the Baltic provinces and strengthen the position of the Orthodox Church in the Baltic provinces, revoked that decision and thus started to arrest and subject to criminal trial Lutheran pastors who were deemed to be, quote-unquote, tempting Orthodox to Lutheranism. Of course, these Lutheran pastors were not tempting Orthodox to go to true Orthodox to go to Lutheranism. What they were doing was performing ceremonies, performing rituals for these people who had converted to Russian Orthodoxy, but they had regretted their decision, but because of the Russian law against apostasy, couldn't rejoin Lutheranism. And the vast majority of the Baltic provinces' Lutheran clergy were actually subjected to criminal trials in the 1880s and 1890s. This provoked an international outcry, and eventually the Tsar, especially in Germany, a Lutheran majority country, and eventually the Tsar was forced to back down and to end the criminal trials against the Lutheran clergy. Now, we're going to be going into all of this in much greater detail in 3 lectures' time. But here you can already see precisely what I mean. Firstly, how Lutheranism is eventually at the beginning of the 19th century, in 1832, subordinated to the Russian state, and how privileges and limitations of this confession alter and change over time depending on the Russian government's particular policies towards a region or towards a group. Toleration is fluid, and sometimes it can mean ignoring apostasy, and other times it can mean strictly enforcing apostasy laws, even when, in reality, there was very little blame involved. Now, Roman Catholicism. Most of the Russian Empire's Catholic population in the regions we today know as Belarus, Poland, and the Western Ukraine. And they become part of the Russian Empire following the partitions of Poland, the free partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century. The Russian state goes through various attempts to create a way of controlling these Catholics. One way is it creates, its first attempt in 1771 is to create a Catholic archdiocese, the Archdiocese of Mogilov, today in Belarus, as the main body in charge of the empire's Catholics. They alter this in the end of the 18th century, creating a Roman Catholic spiritual college, a bit like the equivalent, really, of the Russian Orthodox Holy Synod in St. Petersburg. Again, an overall governing body for the empire's Catholics, which is connected to the secular organs of the Russian state. Now, of course, the Catholics have something that the Lutherans don't, which is a supreme head of their church in the form of the Roman Pope. And the Roman Pope traditionally has maintained his right to create dioceses and to appoint bishops. So, of course, you can see there are going to be clashes, and indeed there were clashes, between the papacy and the Russian government, because the Russian government wanted to appoint bishops who it judged to be politically reliable and loyal to the Russian state, whereas the papacy had other ideas, other priorities. And indeed, there were periods when, throughout the 19th century, when because of disagreements between the Russian government and the papacy over who to appoint as Catholic bishops, there were dioceses which had no bishops for a long period of time. And there are periods where, essentially, the papacy would not recognize the Russian government's candidates, even if those candidates were essentially installed and governing in practice. Now, in the Russian Empire, Catholicism was associated with one main group, and that was one main national group, and that was the Poles. Unlike many of the groups in the Russian Empire, the Poles came into the Russian Empire having a long history of statehood and, at least among their elites, a well-defined notion of identity. This is at least one reason why Poland proved such a volatile area for the Russian Empire. Why there were two huge rebellions in these areas, both of which had as their aim the restoration of the lost Polish kingdom. Basically, Catholicism and the Polish groups pose a continual problem to the Russian state. And because the Russian state associated Catholicism and the Poles so closely, the consequence of the Polish rebellions in 1830 and 1862-63 was that the Catholic Church in these Polish provinces was punished for either its actual participation or for its imagined participation in these rebellions. This led to monasteries being closed, priests being exiled, Russian being imposed as the language of learning in seminaries, etc., etc., etc. Indeed, Polish was also forbidden as the language of religious sermons, especially following the rebellion of 1863, which triggered a Russification wave in the Polish provinces. Now, I mentioned that Catholicism was not a single group in the Russian Empire, and there was another one which we have to consider, because it was a group that was subjected to an extremely large degree of persecution from the end of the 18th all the way deep into the 19th and early 20th centuries. And this was the so-called Uniate Church, the Greco-Catholic Church. Now, just to give you a bit of history, I'm pretty sure many of you have never heard of this group. So I just want to give you a bit of history about them in order to illustrate what they are. The Greco-Catholic Uniate Church was founded at the end of the 16th century as part of a missionary attempt against a Catholic missionary attempt against Orthodoxy in Eastern Europe. And the idea was the Roman Catholic Church created a form of agreement, a union, which would allow Orthodox individuals to convert to Roman Catholicism while keeping their distinctive Orthodox religious rituals, especially in the liturgy. So in other words, the Uniate Church was Catholic in terms of its theology and administrative structure. It was loyal and subordinated to the Pope in Rome, but it had Orthodox rituals, Orthodox liturgies, and you still used Church Slavonic in its, rather than Latin, in its religious celebrations. So you can still see this is a mixture of the two. It's Catholic in theology, it's Catholic in administration, but it's Orthodox in terms of its rituals and Orthodox in terms of its liturgical language. This is an attempt by the Roman Catholic Church at the end of the 16th century to undermine Orthodoxy, particularly in areas of Eastern Poland and in what we today would know as the Ukraine. Now, when Poland is partitioned at the end of the 18th century, a huge number of uniates enter into the Russian Empire, about 2.5 million. And immediately, these individuals pose a deep concern to the Russian Orthodox Church and to the Russian Orthodox state. Both of these bodies, the state and the church, regard these individuals as lost Russian Orthodox who had been stolen by the Catholic Church at the end of the 16th and during the 17th century. And so it believed that it was legitimate, that these individuals were simply lost Orthodox under an illegitimate church structure. And therefore, it was legitimate to, quote unquote, reunify these uniates with the Orthodox Church. Already under Catherine the Great, a large-scale attempt is made to essentially dismantle the Uniate churches in the Uniate Church in the Russian Empire's territory, with hundreds of thousands of Uniate Catholics being forcibly included into Russian Orthodoxy, with Uniate monasteries being closed and with Uniate administrative structures being subjected to ever greater degrees of persecution. This is quite interesting, by the way, because Catherine is typically viewed by historians and I think by the general public today as being a rather tolerant ruler. In this case, she wasn't. In this case, she joined precisely this understanding of these individuals as lost Russian Orthodox subjects stolen by the Catholic Church, and that it was therefore perfectly right to intervene and bring these lost sheep back into the flock, restore these lost children to the great family of Russian Orthodoxy. I can see I've not completed that slide, I beg your pardon. But anyway, what happens after this initial persecution, well, under Alexander I, and into the first couple of decades of the reign, or into the first 15 or so years of Nicholas I, the persecution on the Uniate Church slackens. And again, we see the same pattern emerge. There's an attempt to create Uniate colleges, a Uniate college of some kind in St. Petersburg, which is connected directly again to the secular organs of the Russian state. These efforts basically come to an end in the 1830s under Nicholas, who precisely again returns to this notion that these individuals are not really Catholics. They are lost Russian Orthodox. And what Nicholas does is he launches a full-scale reunification of the Uniates. Again, reunification in quotation marks, because what this really is basically just the closure of all Uniate institutions, the transfer of all churches and monasteries to the Russian Orthodox Church, and the replacement of Uniate clergy with their Russian Orthodox equivalents. And it should be stated, the Uniate Church was generally based, again, as I said, in Eastern Poland, Ukraine, Belarus to a certain degree, in Lithuania as well to a certain extent. The Uniate clergy, the Uniates were not Russian speakers, and often their clergy were not Russian speakers. But when the Russian Orthodox Church replaced them, it precisely sent Russian-speaking Orthodox clergy, again, as a sort of a limited measure of linguistic Russification, to encourage the spread of the Russian language in these provinces. So just to reiterate again, we see with the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church itself, the Roman Catholic Church proper, that is to say the Latin Rite Catholic Church, that although it is tolerated, that it has a legal existence, and it is connected to the Russian state, the extent of that toleration varies over time in reaction to external events, namely the rebellion of the Poles in 1830 and 1863. And as such, its privileges and its limitations change. We see the flexibility here of the multi-confessional establishment. Now, in the case of the Uniates, they only had a very limited, brief period of true toleration in the sort of, at least in the legal meaning that the Russian Empire signed the word toleration, between the reign of Alexander I and 1839. In other periods, they were heavily persecuted, precisely because they were regarded as lost Russian Orthodox, who the Russian state had the right to return to the Catholic, to the Orthodox Church. Just in case you're interested, the Uniate Church still exists today. It's still a quite significant social, cultural, and political force in modern Ukraine, for instance. And it also existed outside of the Russian Empire. There was a significant number of Uniates in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the area known as Galicia. Now, probably the final and the most obscure, I'm sure for most of you, religion in this sort of group of Christian tolerated faiths was Armenian Gregorianism. Now, I'm not going to go into the precise theology of Armenian Gregorianism. Basically, it divided away from the rest of the Christian churches very early in the 4th century. Basically, they divided over a fundamental disagreement over the nature of Christ. To what extent was he man? To what extent was he God? This was basically the division between Orthodoxy and indeed Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestantism, and the Armenian Gregorians. The Armenian Gregorians took a very different view on these so-called Christological questions. Well, in any case, at the beginning of the 19th century, the Russian Empire was increasingly extending its authority into the Caucasus, launching on long-lasting wars with with mainly Muslim populations in the hills of the Caucasus, annexing essentially the Georgian Orthodox Church, and eventually bringing in the sort of eastern part of Armenia into the Russian Empire. The western part remained part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, where in fact the Ottoman Turks had a very similar system to the Russians, with sort of managing their non-Muslim groups. But in any case, again, we see exactly the same thing occurs. The Armenian Gregorian Church has a centralized church leadership, the Catholicos. And basically, the Russian state always tries to impose its candidate as the Catholicos of the Armenian Church. It does so for two reasons, of course. For one reason, it wants the Catholicos to be a loyal and politically suitable, politically flexible subject of the Russian Empire, who will ensure the loyalty of the Armenian population. On the other hand, it wants a reliable political tool to interfere in the Ottoman Turks' relations with their own Armenian minority. I just want to comment again on the Armenian situation. Generally speaking, the relationship is fractious, and in fact, at the very beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Orthodox state briefly attempts to claim all of the property of the Armenian Gregorian Church. However, it has to back down from this policy rather quickly. When the 1905 revolution really kicks off. So again, the policy of toleration was used to co-opt the leader of the Armenian Church into the Russian state, and then the Armenian Catholicos was used as firstly to guarantee the loyalty of this particular subject population, and secondly, as somebody who can be used as a tool in the Russian Empire's foreign policy with regard to the Ottoman Empire to the south. And when the Armenian Church began to break away from this conception, when the Armenian Catholicos at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, began to show disregard for the policies of the Russian state reacted with quite a severe repressive measure by trying to seize all of the Armenian Gregorian Church's property, which only really failed because, first, the measure wasn't particularly practical, and secondly, because of general social disorder emerging during the revolutionary years of 1904-1905. Now let's move on to the non-Christian minorities in the empire, the Muslims, the Buddhists, and the Jews. Now, Islam entered into the Russian Empire in several waves. The first, this process began at the end of the middle of the 16th century, when Ivan the Terrible conquered Kazan, as I mentioned, The Volga at this time was a Muslim majority region. And as the Russian Empire increasingly expanded eastwards and southwards, it gained ever more provinces where Muslims were either a majority or a very substantial minority. So, for instance, it spread into areas like Crimea, where at least at the beginning of the 18th, at the end of the 18th, and from the end of the 18th to the Crimean War, was the majority population on the Crimean Peninsula. The Caucasus, where Muslim tribesmen in areas which we could today call places like Chechnya, Dagestan, etc., dominated. And finally, in the towards the end of the 19th century, the conquest of Central Asia and the long-standing Muslim population groups in those regions. Now, the first efforts to subordinate the Islam to the Russian state come under Catherine the Great, when essentially a Muslim spiritual consistory is created in the town of Ufa. I beg your pardon, Ufa. And again, the role of this spiritual assembly is basically it will take charge of all of the Russian Empire's Islamic groups. It will be subordinated to the organs of the central state, thereby ensuring that the central state has some mechanisms in which to by which to control these Islamic groups. The head of the Ufa Muslim Ecclesiastical Assembly was always a mufti. He was the head of this group. And his role was supplemented in 1828 with the establishment of a general law for all of the Muslims of the Russian Empire. Now, it's worth noting one interesting fact, is that basically when the Russian state attempted to create models of government for these non-Christian groups, it didn't really understand how these religions functioned. In the end of the 18th century, there was very scarce knowledge in Russian, or indeed in most European languages, about the true nature of the organization of Islamic life. But the Russian state wanted to impose a hierarchical administrative model onto Islam, where it didn't really have a hierarchy, where in reality it didn't really have a hierarchical model of religious authority. Basically, again, you sort of see the Russian state looks at the organization of the Russian Orthodox Church, takes that model and tries to impose it on Islam by basically creating a sort of equivalent of the Synod and creating an equivalent of the Metropolitan St. Petersburg. This is a problem throughout the Russian government's treatment of Islam, is that it doesn't really understand the function of Islamic religious and spiritual leaders, and tries to assign them an equivalent role which it finds in Russian Orthodoxy. It's just an interesting aside there, I think. And again, we see some of the same problems emerge for the Muslim minority. The Russian state associates them let's start this. The Russian state questions whether they can be truly loyal, because to the south there is the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which is not only an officially Muslim state, but the Turkish Sultan is the Caliph, the head of Sunni Islam. The Russian Empire is always at war with the Ottoman Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's really its major rival in the international scene. And so there is always a question. What happens if the Turkish Caliph asks for the loyalty of Russian Muslim subjects, asks them to rebel against the Russian Tsar? In other words, Russia is always concerned about the political attitudes and political loyalties of its Islamic subjects, precisely because over the border is a, well, relatively powerful Islamic state with whom Russia is often at war. And the consequences of this following the Crimean War, where Russia fought the Ottoman Empire, the British, the French, and some of the Italians, was that the Russian state conducted a campaign of what we would today call really ethnic cleansing in parts of the empire, particularly in Crimea and in some parts of the Caucasus, essentially exiling the Muslim Tartars from Russia and sending them to the Ottoman Empire. In campaigns where, through poor hygiene, through criminality along the road, through the difficulties of the journey, many died. Many exiled Muslim Tartars died. It has to be said, by the way, just as an aside, it actually doesn't appear like this was a complete overreaction from the Russian state. The Muslims in the Crimea and in the region surrounding the Crimea had been entirely loyal, for the most part, to the Russian cause in the Crimean War. This was, to a certain extent, considered by at least some statesmen as an opportunity to change the demographic situation in the Crimea and in the southern Russian areas surrounding it. And this is why many historians have now adopted the sort of characterization of this as precisely ethnic cleansing, an attempt basically to alter the demographic character of a certain region of the empire. Following this removal of the Muslim Crimean Tatars and a few other groups from the Russian Empire, the Russian state embarked on a very strong Russification campaign on another Muslim majority area, or rather, at this point, an area with a considerable Muslim population, the Volga region. Essentially backing, trying to combat Tatar cultural influence, the Tatar language, and trying to promote the cause of Russian Orthodoxy among both among the Muslim Tatars and other groups in that region. And we're going to discuss that in quite a significant degree of detail in our lecture on Russian missionary campaigns. Then there was, of course, Judaism. Again, there had been very, very few Jews in the Russian Empire before the end of the 18th century, in part because they were forbidden by Russian law from settling within the empire. However, this radically changed when Russia partitioned Poland. Huge numbers of Jews lived in the territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And when Russia partitioned Poland, receiving mostly the eastern and central parts of Poland and Lithuania, it gained that Jewish population. And by doing so, Russia, in fact, became the largest Jewish state, the state with the largest Jewish population in the world. Now, there are various attempts to connect Jewish religious leaders to the Russian state. However, they never really create a centralized body in charge of the affairs of all the Jews of the Russian Empire. Generally speaking, the Russian state creates a series of ad hoc arrangements with individual communities, community administrations. This is one major distinction. This is one way the management of the Jews in the Russian Empire was different from the management of the other groups. They essentially didn't create a central body. They relied on individual agreements, individual relationships with various organs, local Jewish social, religious, and cultural organs operating on the community level. And even here, the state actually removed its recognition for these groups, for these institutions in 1844. Which meant largely that there was no real central body representing the interests of Russian Jews in the central government, or even indeed on the local level. Then there were attempts, different attempts to sort of integrate Jews into the Russian Empire. One of the most significant of these was their conscription, the conscription of Jews into the army. In 1827, Nicholas abolished previous laws, previous measures forbidding the conscription of Jews, and they were now introduced into the army. And the idea was that through their army service, they would become loyal to the state, and become at least Russian, and would become Russian speaking, at least to a certain extent. Now, the Jews probably suffered under the heaviest burden of all the religious groups of the Russian Empire. One of these, very notoriously, was the so-called Pale of Settlement. Basically, a massive area in Eastern Europe, which covered large portions of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, in that sort of general area. The territory inside was the size of modern France. And this was an area where Jews were exclusively allowed to settle within the Russian Empire. They were not supposed to move beyond this region. Now, of course, this did not, in many cases, stop Jews from traveling beyond the region, from trying to settle in other areas, which led to repeated sort of expulsions of Jews from Russian cities and sending them back to the Pale of Settlement. Now, there was some relaxation of this in the Great Reforms of the 1860s, where the Russian government allowed what it considered to be economically useful Jews to move beyond the Pale of Settlement to other areas, which basically created a large sort of a 60,000 strong group now living beyond the Pale of Settlement, particularly around major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Because what the Russian state defined as economically useful was people, perhaps was industrial workers, educated people, sort of doctors, lawyers, administrators, etc., etc. But again, reaction sets in the 1880s. And there are attempts to, these Jewish groups are removed from the Pale, removed from Russian cities and forced back to the Pale of Settlement. Now, when it came to Jewish elites, there were policies that allowed them to attend Russian schools beyond the Pale of Settlement, and especially Russian universities. However, this was usually subject to, especially in the after the 1880s, was subject to a quota system. So in other words, only a certain number of Jews were allowed to study in Russian secondary schools and in Russian universities per year. Popular violence against Jews in mixed communities, particularly, especially in the Pale of Settlement, were frequent occurrences in the course of the 19th century. Now, I've already talked to you about the blood libel, the so-called blood libel. Just to repeat, the blood libel is a utterly false idea that Jews use the blood of Christians, and particularly Christian children, in their religious rituals. And this was an anti-Semitic idea, often promoted to, that often circulated and often was used as an excuse for violence against Jewish groups in various communities. And in the 19th, now basically in the rest of Europe, the blood libel myth was sort of dying a slow death in most of Europe in the 19th century, although of course it was always maintained by anti-Semitic circles throughout the continent. And in Russia, on the contrary, there were still cases of this being tried in the courts. There were two spectacular examples. The Velige affair, which was in fact the longest running blood libel trial in European history, lasting almost 2 decades. And far more notoriously, there was the Bielis affair in the beginning of the 20th century, when the Jew Menahem Bielis was accused of murdering a 13-year-old Orthodox Ukrainian and using his blood supposedly using his blood in the rites. The charges against Bielis were so ridiculously false and so obviously fabricated that it, of course, generated a huge public scandal in the Russian press and indeed in the international press. But nonetheless, he was taken to court. He was acquitted, but only after a very long process of sort of imprisonment and unpleasantness. Pogroms, that is to say, riots directed against Jews, happened recurrently, especially towards the end of the 19th century, when Russian anti-Semitic nationalist groups often sought to encourage such forms of violence against Jewish subjects. They also occurred when civil order collapsed following the revolution between 1905 and 1907. Now, there's considerable debate about pogroms in the literature between historians. What caused the pogroms? What was the role of the Russian state in the pogroms? Have been two sort of constantly debated questions. I'm just going to comment here a bit about the role of the Russian state. To a large extent, the Russian state did not encourage pogroms in various regions. The reason why is because the Russian state was invested above all else in the maintenance of civil order. And of course, rioting, even if it was rioting directed against the Jews, was a threat to that civil order. So the Russian state, at least on a central level, did not actively sponsor pogroms. However, it is quite clear that there were certainly local actors within the local Russian organs of the Russian state who sought to sponsor pogroms. And certainly there is evidence to suggest that the Russian state did not react as quickly or as efficiently as it might have done to prevent the pogroms. Now, the final religious group we're going to discuss today are the Buddhists. So the Buddhists, the Russian Empire, exist basically. Their predominance among the Kazakh the population in Central Asia, and also among the so-called Buryat population surrounding Lake Baikal, with the nearest city being Irkutsk. And again, basically sort of area around Irkutsk had become part of the Russian Empire in the sort of end of the 17th century, and the Russian Empire expanded into the sort of Kazakh steppe, where Buddhism was also a major force in the 18th century. And again, we see exactly the same pattern recurs. In 1764, the Russian state creates a sort of hierarchical leader for the empire's Buddhist communities, the Bandido Kama Lama. I apologize to any Buddhists watching for my pronunciation of that. Who is essentially in charge of all the empire's Buddhist population and is directly responsible to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. So again, the same pattern. The leaders of non-Orthodox faiths are subordinated to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and an institution is created where one did not previously exist, to allow that religious leader to exercise a degree of administrative control on behalf of the Russian state over his religious group. And of course, it goes without saying, is that basically the Russian state always attempted to ensure that the Bandido Kama Lama was a Russian citizen. So in other words, someone who was born within the Russian Empire. It didn't want the position going to someone, for example, from Chinese Buddhist groups. Throughout the Russian Empire, there were various groups of what we today would call polytheists, people worshipping multiple gods. Generally speaking, these were sort of nature-worshipping groups who worship things like the sea, the sky, the air, so on and so forth. These were either Finnic-speaking peoples, so their languages are distantly related to Finnish and Estonian and Hungarian, or they were Turkic-speaking peoples, so their languages were related to Turkish, to some Turkish groups. I'll give you an example here. The Maori, who were in the Volga and Ural regions, who were a Finno-Ugric group. The Chuvash, again in the Volga and Ural regions, but they were a Turkic-speaking group. And the Altaians, who were in the south of, in a southern western Siberian region, they were a Mongol-speaking group. And basically, these individuals, these various groups were never sort of brought into a centralized relationship with the Russian state. In fact, in 1822, under the Siberian law code, they were given freedom of conscience. Probably the only religious group in the empire to be given this notion of freedom of conscience. And their lack of centralized organization meant that they were usually the targets of local missionary effort, of Russian Orthodox missionary efforts. So okay, then I've just given you then an overview of the various minority faiths and their relationship to the Russian Empire, to illustrate the first two slides of a lecture, basically to illustrate how toleration worked in practice, how links to the government were created, and how privileges and limitations altered over time in reaction to various external and internal circumstances. Now I want to move on to the last part of our lecture, which is to deal with an emerging concept in the Russian Empire and in Europe in the 19th century, this notion of freedom of conscience. I think we'll skip this. So freedom of conscience is basically the idea that an individual has the sovereign right, the inviolable right, to choose their own faith. External parties, like the state, should not have the right to determine which religion you belong to. Freedom of conscience is the freedom to choose your religion, to follow your conscience, choose the religion that suits you best, and nobody should be able to remove that right or violate that right. In other words, this is a right, not a privilege. And this idea, freedom of conscience, is gradually becoming a civil liberty, a civil right established in most European countries throughout the 19th century. However, the Russian Empire consistently rejected the right of freedom of conscience until 1905, and indeed, even after 1905, didn't really implement it properly into its legislation. For the Russian Empire, religion was a mechanism of state control. The group you were born into was a way of assigning privileges, limitations, assigning responsibilities, of managing subject populations. Religion, so just to rephrase that, religion is basically a tool for managing the populations of the Russian Empire from the perspective of the state. And because of that, the state does not really want to see people moving around, changing their religion constantly. This is why it has its apostasy laws. The state basically believes that if people were moving between faiths all of the time, in accordance to the whims of their conscience, this would damage religion's utility as a mechanism of administration and control of the various subject populations. However, certainly in Russian intellectual circles, by the great reformers of the 1860s, freedom of conscience is becoming ever more popular among liberal and radical groups. People arguing that the individual has the right to determine their faith, not the group, not circumstance of birth, not the state, but the individual has the inviolable right to choose their faith. This marks the liberal and radical arguments holding up the individual as supreme value in any given society. And as I just mentioned, while on occasion some leading members of the Russian state look sympathetically on the idea of introducing freedom of conscience, especially because Russia's system of religious management, its multi-confessional establishment, was looking increasingly old-fashioned compared to European regimes where freedom of conscience was being introduced. Nonetheless, the Russian state consistently opposed and rejected the idea of including freedom of conscience into the Russian law code. The result was that by the beginning of the 20th century, liberal and radical groups, in other words, the groups that were generally now emerging in opposition to the Tsarist regime, cherished the idea of freedom of conscience as the most sacred right. Now, in 1905, in the chaos of the revolution, Nicholas II is forced to make concessions to the rebelling Russian people. The first such concession comes on the 17th of April, 1905, when Nicholas issues an edict expanding the limits of toleration in the empire. One of the major concessions in this new legislation is that people had the right to convert away from Russian Orthodoxy. In other words, the apostasy law, which forbade people from moving away from Russian Orthodoxy, was repealed, was no longer held to be in force. People could now, after this edict, change their faith. Other measures were introduced in this law. For instance, the idea that other faiths could have missionary movements, for instance, was somewhat considered in this legislation. A lot of the points of the edict related to the old believers. So we're going to discuss it in greater depth tomorrow. But a general takeaway is this law abolishes the prohibition against apostasy. However, on a fundamental level, this new edict does not change, does not abolish the multi-confessional system. The hierarchy of toleration still exists. All that has happened is there's been some slight amendments, some privileges have been given, some people have changed position on the hierarchy, but the hierarchy itself and all the underlying assumptions of the hierarchy still exist. It is still presumed that toleration is a privilege. It is not a right. In other words, Nicholas is doing what he can to try and salvage the privilege-based regime, while also giving some concessions which he hoped would calm the situation, particularly in the rebelling Russian borderlands, Russian imperial borderlands. Well, it didn't really work. It didn't really satisfy many people. And so in October, Nicholas was finally forced to go further with his October manifesto. And in the October manifesto, Nicholas finally conceded freedom of conscience to Russian citizens. However, as I've said quite a few times in this lecture already, and I'll repeat again, this commitment to freedom of conscience in the manifesto is never legislated. It never actually becomes a full law in the Russian law code. The Edict of Toleration does. And so basically from 1905 until the revolution in 1917, the Edict of Toleration is the fundamental Russian law on religious matters. Freedom of conscience is never really truly introduced. It never really has a major effect on how Russian administrators, both in the center and the provinces, deal with religious questions. In other words, the privilege-based hierarchy of toleration and multi-confessional establishment remain in force until 1917, when the provisional government comes to power following February 1917, freedom of conscience is finally established as an inviolable right of Russian citizens and is brought into law. So again, let's just conclude this lecture. From the 1760s until the 1830s, the Russian state establishes what I've called here, borrowing from Paul Worth, the multi-confessional establishment. A flexible series of institutions and legal arrangements that bind religious minorities to the organs of the Russian state. Through this multi-confessional establishment, privileges are given and limitations imposed on different groups. These privileges and limitations are not permanent possessions of the people. They are gifts from the Tsar given at his indulgence, and they can be withdrawn or altered and amended. at his will, depending on government policy. I gave you several examples of how this was achieved, of the different central institutions created for Christian and non-Christian faiths in the Russian Empire, how they were bound through these institutions to the government, and how changing circumstances led to the alteration of the amount of toleration and the amount of persecution to which they were subjected. In many ways, this system, especially at the beginning of the 19th century, this system worked very well. It was very flexible, well, at least from the perspective of the Russian state. It worked very well. It was very flexible and did give a certain amount of liberties to recognized faiths in the empire. It was also quite comparable, quite favorably comparable in some ways to the religious policies of other European states at that time. However, by the end of the 19th century, this is no longer the case. For one thing, most European states have moved away from a rights-based regime, a privilege-based regime to a rights-based regime. They are giving freedom of conscience, freedom of religion to their religious minorities. But the Russian Empire continues to remain with its old system. The Russian Empire, in other words, looks not only increasingly old-fashioned, it looks crude and indeed even barbaric in its approach to barbaric and cruel in the approach to its minorities. Nonetheless, the multi-confessional system, the establishment, survives the revolution of 1905. Nicholas makes some adaptations to it in the Edict of Toleration in April 1905, but it essentially remains in place. The attempt to introduce freedom of conscience was never really realized, partially because Nicholas never really wanted it. It was something he was forced to concede by the breakdown of civil order in the 1905 attempted revolution. As a result, it can be argued, many religious groups previously loyal to the imperial regime ceased to be so by 1917, leading to their support for independence movements in the general chaos of the First World War and the Russian February Revolution. Okay, and I think that brings us to the end of today. So I'll see you next time when we're going to be discussing old believers and sectarians. Thank you very much.